Galatians. Jim, can I get you to open us in prayer?
Sure.
Thanks.
Lord, we thank you for this opportunity we have each week to study your word. Lord, we just ask that you guide our discussion and teach us. So, in Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. I see we're missing a bunch of people tonight, but I know Darren, I was going to say, is working a concert tonight, security, so he can't be here. And Linda's still one more night in Canada, and several others, so a lot of trips and stuff. Anyway, we're going to get back into chapter 5. We're going to pick up on verse 14 again because we only did part of it. Now, we're not going to rerun all the same stuff we did last time, but there are a few other things in verse 14 that we want to look at, okay? And I'm going to read 13 and 14 for context. For you were called to freedom, brethren, only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, one of the questions we never actually got to is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The question is, who is your neighbor? We kind of sort of hit that a little bit in the end, but give me some thoughts here before I go in and jump into things. Who is your neighbor?
Well, that's the same thing they asked Jesus when he told the cripple, well, who's my neighbor?
They did, you're right. Now, let me say this. The answer may be different depending on the context, too, as well. But yes, but you're right. So who do you think is, if I said to you about your neighbor in reference to this verse specifically, who would you say your neighbor is?
Well, I instantly go to the Good Samaritan story.
Okay.
And see that he answered that question with.
Okay.
So, but
okay. Which would basically be anybody as your neighbor in that case.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You're saying something?
No.
Okay.
Just gonna make a joke.
I think we have to be a little careful in
Yes, I
one thing, in that in certain spots in Scripture, the word neighbor can mean different things. Okay? In the context of this book, I think it means something a little bit different than it does, in the Good Samaritan story. And I'll tell you why. If you look at this book, this is talking about, he's writing to the church specifically and telling the church specifically about interaction within the church, about not following the law anymore. And here, when it's a neighbor, I think in this case he's actually referring to other believers in the church primarily, because that's where the interaction is occurring. Okay? Not to say we should be, terrible to the people that are not in the church, okay? One of the other things I want to bring up too is in the Old Testament, whenever you're talking about your neighbor or things like that in let's say with the Jews, okay? They weren't talking about people around the world. They were talking about other Israelites. So the context there typically would be, one thing you don't see is you don't ever see God saying, for example, well, let me see, Syria just had a problem, so go set up a fund for Syria or something like that. It's always within Israel. Within the New Testament, typically, especially if you look beyond the Gospels, whenever you're looking at things in the New Testament, is within the church. Now, it doesn't mean we're to be, again, ugly to people outside the church, and we do have some responsibilities outside the church, okay?
Well, they had some examples, though, of one church taking up a collection for another church that was
And yeah, exactly.
had a famine.
Yeah,
in their area.
when I say in the
That was
church,
to
when I say in the church, I
local
don't
church.
mean just the local church.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
Now let me say this: I do believe your highest level of neighborship is in the local church, but then comes the rest of the other believers in the world, which are part of the church also. And then following that, again, I'm not saying, for example, I'm not saying it's wrong to set up a soup kitchen or a mission. By the same token, I think you have to be careful. Churches have to be careful with their money and how they use it, because a lot of times I've seen churches that are giving to the neighborhood around them, but they're missing what's in their own church or what's in the local churches that near them that need it as well, and that has to come first, I believe. One thing I want to look at also for this is, turn, if you would, just for a moment here, to chapter 6, verse 10. And it just gives us a hint as to what it means by this. If you look at 6:10, it says, so then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all men, and especially to those who are of the household of the faith. So I do believe, for example, we can't go out and decide, well, these people aren't Christians, so it's okay to lie to them and cheat them. No, that's wrong. Let me say, believe it or not, I've known Christians who have taken that attitude. Well, they're not really Christians. I don't have to worry about them. I can get away with this. I know. I disagree with that completely, obviously. By the same token, and I have also heard other Christians, I have no responsibility to people. I don't even have to be nice to them because they're not part of the church. No, I do believe we have a responsibility, with our as possible, as they allow it, with our neighbors. Oh yeah, that's the friendly neighbor who's nice to you and stuff like that. So now let me say this: there are some cases where the neighbors won't allow that. That's okay. Again, we're friendly as we're able to be friendly to people. Not only that, we're helpful to our neighbors and stuff like that. Our literal neighbors, houses next door and things like that. So I think that's fine. But there's a level of this neighbor thing here that we're saying is when it says especially to those of the household of faith, that is a higher priority than to people in general. And one of the reasons is when we're taking care of the needs of those within our own church, okay? And when we're not, I don't want to just make this all about money. It's not all about money either. I mean, it can be helping things, it can be friendship, it can be any number of things, okay? But when we're taking care of the needs of people within our church, that's also an example to those around us that are outside the church that can go, hey, wait, they do show love to one another within the church. That's why I think it's more important within a local church than it is, for example, not to negate it, but than it is, for example, to just any person you happen to meet on the street. So again, this is something where we have to think about it. Also, if we look at the context of this chapter with 13 through 15, again, all of that is talking about making sure that your Christian brother does not stumble. Not all. That's what's in there. It's not saying, again, we don't want to make people of the world stumble either, but the context here is make sure that your liberty doesn't make your Christian brother stumble. It's not going to matter quite as much. For example, I don't think I've ever had a non-believer say to me, do you drink alcohol? Something like that. Well, maybe they're an alcoholic or something. But I mean, the point being is that they don't care. It's not part of their, frankly, not only that, are you sexually promiscuous? They don't care. In the church, we should care, things like that. So that's where, again, I think it's talking primarily to our interaction with believers here, and not to say we shouldn't be, not to say we shouldn't be cognizant of the people around us, but sometimes, for example, should we be just using money in general to fund things in the neighborhood? Probably not. It's been, if you got a rich church and you got too much money, you got money to burn, well, then I would say, well, first maybe look for that, but also look for other churches that might need help in your area, things like that. And you mentioned about funds for people who had disasters and stuff. Back in the church when I was at Lanham Grace, we actually had about 30% of our money coming in was going out to missionaries and things like that. And there were definitely, I remember one church that had problems didn't have the money to send their kids to a youth conference. We wanted them to attend, and they said, can you help? And yeah, here's a check. So that type of thing I think is very appropriate. I have no problem with that at all. The other thing, if we start looking at this, is when it says about you fulfilled the law in one word, the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Okay? We have to be very careful of that statement. Look at the context here, because honestly, I have seen many people take this as if you're loving and you're showing love, you're a believer and you're going to heaven. Well, I think we can all think of a lot of people who may be very loving people who are not going to heaven. The example I've used over and over again, I don't know what was really in her heart, but if her words were true, Mother Teresa couldn't have been a Christian. You hear about her, but she was incredibly loving to many of the people, to the lepers and people like that. And my point being is that there's many examples we can come by. Let me say this. I have disagreements with the theology of Islam, obviously. Okay? And let me say this also. There are a lot of radical Islam. There are also a lot of Islam that maybe not are radical, but it becomes very obvious. If you're not Islamic, you're going to be treated very differently than their Islamic friends. However, I've also had Islamic friends who were nice people, treated me well and everything like that, who were loving people. They're going to end up in hell, unfortunately. But we got to be careful here not to reverse this. Almost like, taking an equation and turn it around, it doesn't work the other way.
If P then Q doesn't necessarily mean if Q then P.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And not just that, but also like what is in logic it's
Contrapositive?
Yeah, contrapositive, and I was going to say it's affirming the I forget now, but it's basically taking the result and the cause and turning them around. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work a lot of times. So the point being is that in this case, I think we got to be careful here, because otherwise we can end up with theology that literally says, well, if you're really, really loving, you must be of God, and if you must be of God, you're going to heaven. That's not true. There are many, many loving people who are going to hell. And the other thing also I've heard Christians say many times is, well, since every individual before salvation is totally depraved without Jesus Christ, therefore, since they're in total depravity, nothing they do can actually be good or loving. That's not true. Well, that's actually not uncommon in Presbyterian churches to hear that in particular. That's not true. There are very loving people who are good. What that total depravity actually means is there's nothing we can do to show our righteousness to God and be shown as righteousness. It doesn't mean nothing we can do on our own to be righteous. It doesn't mean that we can't do loving things. Again, I've known very loving people and very kind people that were not believers. Actually, it was very heartbreaking to see them die finally and knowing they weren't believers as well. So we got to be a little careful about that. And again, I don't really see that here, but I mention that because I've seen it a lot. All of these things I've seen a lot of times. Yeah, you see.
What was one of those verses like 14 or something?
14 is what we're on right now, end of 14.
And are you saying that's one of the ones that gets taken out of context?
Yeah, it does. It turns it around because, like I said, many times people will take verse like 14 and go, oh, if you're loving. And if you look at the context here, it's ridiculous to try to say, if you love, therefore you're a believer. But out of context, it's very easy to make this verse say that, especially because, remember, Paul never mentioned about the first rule being love God in this case, but the reason was because the context made it obvious. Obviously, that's the first rule. He didn't have to say that. The second rule is, love your neighbor as yourself. And one of the things this gets in, well, so hold up on that. The other thing also, it says, what about love? It says here, let me see, you shall love your neighbor. It is a second person singular indicative, which is really just saying you love. I think it's singular because it's saying, instead of plural, it's not saying all of them. I think what it's saying is each and every one of you, if that makes sense. Nobody is exempt from this. Whereas if it was plural, I think Paul would have been saying about, well, as a group, if you see what I'm saying. No, not as a group. Every member of the group is responsible for this. There's no exceptions. So I think that's why he turned to that. The other thing I was going to say is the word fulfill, about the whole law is fulfilled, is actually a word which we really could translate. Fulfill is fine. The other word I would use here is complete. That we complete the law by that. We fulfill the law by that. And it's also interesting because that's a perfect passive. Perfect passive means we're not the ones doing the action. So what does it mean by fulfilling if we're, and this is where it gets very confusing at the end of this verse, okay? Why is it a perfect passive? Perfect is something where there's already been an act done typically with the effects continuing. Passive means we didn't do it. So how did we end up doing this? And he's telling us, you do it. And then saying, but it's already been done by somebody else. Any thoughts on that? I think this fits together well, but it's a confusing verse at first if you look at it linguistically in the original language.
I'd like you to set the question up again.
Okay. Basically, he's saying to each and every one of you, you do this. And then turning around with the fulfill and saying it's a perfect passive, meaning you fulfill the law, oh, it's already done by somebody else, and the effects are continuing onwards. Well, that doesn't make sense, does it? I mean, right there he's saying somebody else did it, and they've already done it, and the effects are continuing onwards, and you make sure you do this. I think there is a very logical reason, but it's something that we have to think about, because here's what I think is happening here. I think what he's actually saying is Christ is the one who's already completed the act. Christ is the one who has changed you. Because you've been changed by this act and the effects continue onwards, and because Christ did this, it wasn't you, it was Christ that made you righteous. Now you are a changed person, and now you have the responsibility to follow forward and live out what you already are. Now, I may be reading into that a little bit, but I think it's the only explanation I can come up with that actually explains why he changed in the verb forms he was using right there, because otherwise it really doesn't make sense.
That doesn't come through in the English, though, right?
It doesn't come through in the English. And in the Greek, you look at it and go, oh, it's confusing, but okay, I got it. In the English, no, it doesn't come through at all in the English. For one thing, if I translated that in English, I'd almost have to say, for the whole law is fulfilled, because remember, Jesus Christ already did this, and the effects are continuing onward, and because of that, he's made you a changed person. And now, you need to follow through. Well, I wrote that in English, people would, it'd be absurd. But that's really...
But at least you could come to the conclusion you're coming to.
You could. But it's something, again, I would say, translate it the way you translated it, And as people get deeper into this verse, they'll be able to see more eventually if they can't with help. This is a verse, honestly, not everybody's going to get.
Just curious, it maybe went over this because I showed up late.
It's okay.
But it said it was fulfilled in one word. What was the one word? Love?
Basically, yeah, but to fill in one word, I would say it. I think that's probably the wrong way to.
It doesn't really mean literally one word.
Right, it's a statement. Now let me say this: if we look back in the original
One
here again,
saying, right?
yeah, 14. The whole is fulfilled in one word, logos, and it literally says logos. Okay.
Okay.
Here is the problem, and see, in the English, for example, New American Standard actually added the phrase in one word in the statement. That's not in the original. Okay.
Oh.
Now let me say this: there's a reason for it. Logos has a minimum of over 100 known lexical uses.
Oh, you mentioned that, yeah.
Right. Logos can mean word, but logos also, when it says Christ is the logos, does that mean that Christ is only one word? He's limited to that? No, of course not. If we're talking about what it is, the word, the logos, can also be the message, or the statement. But in addition to the message or the statement, in the case of John chapter 1, I believe he was actually looking at Greek rhetoric and was actually talking about the fact that Jesus Christ was the reason for everything and the prime mover for everything in the universe. That God the Father commanded it and Jesus Christ did it. That's a whole different story there, but my point is, you see, the difference between the logos being the's a word, so that's the logos, okay? And the difference between being you were the prime mover for the entire universe, well, that's a big difference, okay? That's all logos. And that's what I'm trying to say is, this word here, logos, good question, because really I would not translate this as a word. I would say for the whole law is summed up in one statement.
Okay. Yeah, and I just noticed it when you said it. It does say in the statement.
Yeah, but that adds to it.
But it's confusing.
Right,
it
says one word in the statement. I would just say one statement. Yeah. And that would be an accurate way of translating logos.
There's a similar thing in French, mot, M-O-T, can mean word, or it can mean a little saying.
Exactly. So
same term applies to a word.
Right, or a statement. And let me say this, in the Greek, a Greek person reading this never would have had the question you had. And I'm glad you had it.
Yeah.
But a Greek person would have said, oh yeah, no problem.
Yeah, so it makes sense that we have questions about this translated version.
Because
did you already cover like this statement, you shall love your neighbors yourself? Like
pretty much.
Well, okay.
And basically we're going over that aspect of who is the neighbor we're covering. And the neighbor, it turns out, in context, really, you've got to look at the other believers, your first neighbor.
So we're not supposed to love everybody as we would love ourselves?
No, we went through that before. But here's in general, here's what I'm going to say. In general, I would say this. There are different levels of what we should be doing.
Yeah.
We shouldn't prioritize non-believers in the community above believers in our church who have the need.
I came
things
in
like that. Yeah. So that, and not only that, Paul emphasized that in chapter 6. So again, I don't want to take away and make it look like we're not loving of other people, because we should be known because we're a loving, nice person. When people talk about you, they should be going like, oh yeah, he's a nice guy, good guy. You know what I'm saying? I had to do a background check last week in order to do some. They require it for guest preaching and stuff like that at some place. I'm glad they do. Okay.
Yeah.
Now they didn't go real deep, but one of the things I had to turn over references. No problem, you need 100 people that know me well, that are, in positions of, that are pastors, teachers, etc., no problem. And I was glad for that. You should be known by that. You should be known by the fact that if somebody says, I need a reference that you're a decent guy and that you're not some kind of a pedophile and that you're not this and you're not that, you shouldn't go, darn, I don't think there's anybody that could say that about,
So hopefully there's someone out there.
Yeah, hopefully we are known by being a loving person. That goes beyond our church. By the same token, when we're loving within our local church, it shows to the people outside the church. So that's the difference also. Now, back in, let me say this, the summary of all this, what I'm saying is, because of the way the verbs form, because of this, who is the neighbor, etc., it basically comes down to, we should love each other because of what Christ has done for us and how he has changed us, and therefore that should be a natural outflow. One of the things we forget sometimes is that the love should be a natural thing. It shouldn't be, oh darn, I've got to love today, not again. There's an issue if you got that. But I'm not saying we don't get tired. Let me say, I told you what I was doing yesterday, okay? my back and my hip hurt today, okay, with all I was carrying around and doing, okay? That doesn't mean you don't have aches and pains. It means right now if somebody says, hey, could you help me dig the garden out in front of the church? No. You know, it wouldn't be unloving to say that. But it does mean that there should be a general loving attitude and spirit and a general caring for each other. You know, I mean, I'll say this. There are times when things happen to people in this church. I don't always go say it, but it's like, yeah, I go home and talk to Linda, and it's like, wow, that really, I'm sorry for that. Yeah, it's an empathy. It's more than, not just sympathy, it's an empathy and things like that. So that's what we should have. Anything else on 14? I think we finally wrapped up 14 after 2 weeks. No, 13 and 14 after 2 weeks. But anything else on 14? If not, we're going to try 15. Oh, I thought I heard something. 15. But if you bite and devour one another, take care lest you be consumed by one another. Okay? Ooh, that's a strong statement, isn't it? And who's he talking about here? He's talking about believers. He said, if you do this. Now, one thing I haven't looked at, I haven't looked at the condition. In English, if we say if, it can mean many, many things. Okay? If might mean, I hope this might happen someday. If might mean, I know this is about to happen. It can mean anything in between the two, okay? In English, in Greek rather, you basically have 5 different types of if-then-else statements, essentially. Each is identified by, like I said, by how it's set up in the sentence. And you can actually look at it. And when I say that, there's 4 that everybody agrees on, although one of those 4 never appears in the Bible. And there's a 5th one that I agree with, and many scholars agree with, but some people say no, it's actually part of the 3rd class condition. So don't worry too much about that. But here's the point. There are multiple things where you look at it and you go, oh, wait, the statement started with this word for if instead of that word. And not only that, wait, that's subjunctive instead of indicative, type things like that. And you go, oh, wait, that's what that if means. That if then specifically means if, and again, I haven't looked at this one to see what it is, to be honest with you. I should have. But what I'm saying is if can mean anything from, you know, if, and I hope it happens, to we're going to assume this is the truth, just for the sake of argument, to I know it's the truth type things. And so my point being is I haven't looked at this.
These are moods.
No, moods are different. Moods are subjunctive, indicative, etc. These are actually special things for if-then-else statements. And that's what applies here. And again, I didn't look it up, and I wish I remembered all 5 of them and could tell you right off the top of my head. I don't. I have to look them up.
It's like since, S-I-N-C-E.
Well, actually, no, that's actually usually like the word therefore. And let me say, one of those conditions sort of implies that. But for example, when you see the word therefore, since a lot of times applies. If, the one that you have to remember that is fairly common is if, and we know this is true.
Right.
So that's the one that happens a lot of times. And I think what he said, no, well, here's the other thing too. Sometimes it means if, but we know this couldn't possibly happen. Other times are if, but it shouldn't happen type thing, okay? And the moods do play into that also, indicative or subjunctive, for example. But the point I'm trying to make here is we look at this and it says, but if you bite and devour one another. Is that something that should be happening in the church?
No.
Okay, obviously, yeah. If I heard yes in here, we're going to have a longer conversation, okay? So, yeah, exactly. So obviously not that. But there's several things here that it's even worse than it looks like, okay? That word, the first word, beware, but you know, actually I didn't even put that in the NASB. Basically, they're starting off with an idiom, and it's actually blepete, which is second person plural of blepo, and blepo means to see, or to see, okay? Blepo, you know, blepo is eyesight, things like that, okay? And then it's may is the word after it. May means not, okay? So see not. Essentially what it is, it's an idiom. It doesn't quite come across in English, okay? But in English, what that is actually saying is, whoa, take care lest, beware, watch out for this, do not let this happen type thing, okay? So that's what this is starting out with when he says that, when he sees that, when he's saying, you know, blepete me, don't let this happen. And again, it's an idiom, so if you try to translate it literally if they translated that, you see, you know, that you devour each other, see not by one another, and you go, huh? What are you talking about? It's an idiom. But the idiom is very clear to the Greek people again. And the other thing that comes out here is bite, okay, where it says, if you bite and devour one another. the word there that's used for bite is not a word typically used for animal bites or human bites. That bite is specifically for snake bites. Okay? So it's literally saying, the reason I say that is, let me say this. If I think of Christians being fed to the lions, okay, I'll say this also. When you think of that and you stood in the Colosseum thinking about that, it takes on a whole different meaning to you. But the thing, especially when you have guys, the tour guide, laughing about the fact that he felt it was appropriate because it was entertainment for the Romans and they were more important anyway, but that's another story. But what I was going to say is that as revolting as that is, somehow there's not the sleaziness of it or the slipperiness of it. I'm referring to the animal, not people setting it up, of the snake bites. Snake bites, you don't expect it. Also, whoa, where'd that come from type thing. Also, they're slithering in among things. There is a natural revulsion, I think, that occurred at the fall where God put a natural revulsion in humans towards snakes in many cases. Doesn't follow with all people, but it's just something as a visceral thing that kind of hits people, okay? Well, here he's talking about snake bites. And in addition to that, it talks about devouring one another. This may be a reference to the fact that with the snake bites, and I know with asps, I don't know with all snakes, but with asps, essentially the female snake gets pregnant and the babies are born by literally eating their way out and killing the mother. Yeah. That's disgusting. I mean, it really is to me at least. And that's what he's saying is, if you bite and devour one another and eat your mother to get out of pregnancy type thing, and you're like, whoa, and unfortunately, we've been in churches like that. We've seen churches like that. But the other thing I was going to say is where it says here also about consumed, lest ye be consumed by one another. Better translation might be the idea of consumed as in consumed by a fire where there's nothing left of the original. There's ashes left, but there's really nothing left. It's all been converted. The energy's been released, and it's all been converted into something totally different here. So Paul's talking about something that's really ugly, okay? And I would also say in my mind, this applies to every single believer in the church. There's no one exempt from this. Again, look at the context of what he's been saying about showing love. There is no believer that can say, I'm okay, I got the, Linda and I have often jokingly talked about our spiritual gifts. And what was it? Mine was judgmentalism and condescension, and hers was, I forget what hers was, but it's a joke, okay, not for real. But the point being is that how many churches have you seen where it is like that?
I haven't seen any, but I
haven't
seen that many either.
Right, I have. And
but,
yeah.
Well, I mean, what do you fight over? I mean, because back here it makes sense.
Anything.
Because I can see them fighting over translation and what does translation? I guess maybe they weren't.
Well, let me say this.
So but they were fighting about.
They were the
law,
original.
Right?
Their fight was the law or not, but that's not all. They had to live with each other too. They had to be around each other. Yeah. What were they fighting about? Get your elbow off the table. Literally. Not only that, honestly, in church stuff, as far as fighting,
yeah.
I don't know what's going on here, and I'm not applying this church, okay? But who are we going to call as pastor? Oh man, that brings up some fights. Have you checked some references yet? Not only that, but how about things like, you're playing what kind of music in this church?
Yeah, I've heard that. I have heard that before, just kind of
Yeah. I will say this, one thing that I hope I was on the right side, I think I was, Belinda and I got upset about and talked to the pastors about, was that basically the length of the skirts of the women on stage, when you can sit in the audience and see the color of their underwear, there's a problem.
Yeah. And
that was happening repeatedly at one church I know.
I thought you were about to say post kneecap versus pre.
No, we're talking, and not only that, let me say, in one case where a woman basically wore a man's shirt with the cut, hanging down like this, and didn't have any skirt on or anything. So, and she was on stage leading.
Yeah,
when I saw that, it was like, well, wait a second. This is really the modesty that God wants for us to lead the church with. Okay.
Yeah.
That's one thing. But I mean, not only that. How about the fact of, I don't know, your music had a beat to it this morning. We got a problem with that. Let me say this. I spent, when I was about 19 years old, 20 years old, I spent a summer working for Good News Clubs, but then also took a little over a month of that and spent it in the West Indies as a summer missionary. One of the missionary houses we stayed with, his daughter came and started playing the piano. And he yelled at her. Two things. Number one, stop playing that Wagner. Wagner in German.
That's a type.
Wagner. Yeah. But stop playing that Wagner. And the reason? It had minor keys, minor chords in it. We don't play music with minor chords in this house.
I don't know what a minor chord is. I guess.
Well, don't worry. My point being is, you would if you heard it.
Okay.
Most of the hymns were made in major keys. Did you know that?
But the point is, to him, it was a sin to play that.
I thought they might have to do something with Wagner himself.
No, yeah, I know. Yeah, Wagner. Yeah.
There's a lot of
It
people
was,
who don't.
yeah.
German pagan themes.
Right. That wasn't the reason why. It was the minor chords, and it wasn't religious music either in this case. But my point being is, we all have our. We say this. I know churches where, for example, man, if you take a sip of alcohol, you are going to have people right in your face saying, "What in the world are you doing?"
Yeah.
Okay.
I think there's a lot more. Those are. I'm not trying to categorize them. Let me just say there's a lot more mundane things where we can disagree, and that can elevate.
Right.
I mean, we are an organization here where we are going to spend money to do things, or we have to evaluate things. I mean, the pastor is one thing, but that's even if we're
Curtain colors.
What's that?
Curtain colors.
Curtain colors,
Yeah.
chair colors, carpet
Sure.
colors, replacing the door, everything where we have to decide something because we're so democratic. Then you have to, if you have to evaluate something, there's going to be opinions there, and so there's ample areas to bite and devour.
And one other mundane area that I've seen, I haven't heard it here yet. Okay, but honestly, if we had a room like this and the tables weren't perfectly squared off when we left or something like that, they left the table in that room. That's terrible. Okay, somebody forgets and leaves a bottle sitting on a table afterwards. Did you see that mess they made? I'm not kidding. That's the type of stuff you hear. And why? Because unfortunately, churches contain people, and it causes problems. And Paul is saying, don't do this. This is not the way to act with one another. Let me say a couple of things. Number one, church fights can be particularly ugly. Almost like, for example, nobody can hurt you like your family members can. Because that means something to you.
Yeah.
If they did the same thing to you that an outsider did, it would hurt you more that the family member did it.
They know things too. They know things.
That too. But I mean, yeah, exactly, yeah. Which is how you can get them, if you know things about them, that's how you get them to shut up. No, anyway. But in the church, we're family here. And because of that, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like really minor stuff to me. That's like, why are you... Some of
Good.
that sounds like, why are you complaining?
Good. But
But,
do you remember what I said this morning about hassles?
yeah, I remember. Yeah.
It's the death by 1,000 cuts kind of thing almost.
It is.
Because those are the kind of things like
But that's,
every time I come in here, this bottle is left here. So that just builds up, and finally I see you put it down there and say, how many, and I do something, I bite your head off. It's like, that's how things like that.
And then my reaction is, I'm bringing 2 bottles next week. No, but it's a good example. We're not in a bottle fight. But yeah, I know. But it's good. But yeah, it is a good example.
And so it's those little things.
Yeah.
And then if we're not, they can just take over.
Yeah. And that's what he's saying here is, it's not, when you don't have the law, you're not being told, don't do this, don't do that. You've got the love for one another. That love for one another should be restraining you as well as causing you to do things.
Yeah.
Some things will restrain and some things will cause. But the point is, that's the way we should be living. Let me say this. I have some examples. What can happen in a church? Okay, I went to one church business meeting. About 500 people at it. Had to have armed sheriff's deputies at the business meeting. I wish I were kidding.
Yeah.
This thing was in the Washington Post, the Washington Star at the time. Man, Star was probably going. The Washington
Were they there
Post.
before it started?
Hmm?
Were they pre-ordered or?
They had them there because they knew what might happen at the time.
Okay.
Yeah, let me say this. I had 2 times, and one of them was after that meeting, and one was another time, when I had people come up and grab me in church and put their arm back and threaten to punch me in the face. Okay, in the sanctuary. In both cases, it was ironic. Both cases were non-believers, but they were there because their family were there, and they were angry because they were non-believers, and they were going to punch me. I got out of that place eventually. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned a democratic process
Right.
leads to these kind of things.
It can. I've seen it the opposite too.
Non-democratic
Yeah.
processes can.
The
Oh, yeah, yeah.
the subject matter
Mhm.
is important, right? I mean, the meaning of life, basically.
Yeah.
So it's similar to people who treat politics as religion these days, because look at all the biting and devouring
goodness, yeah.
in that realm. It's horrible.
Well, politics has been horribly poisoned.
But you also have to look, and I don't disagree with it, but you also have to look at the fact that a lot of times when we're talking about politics, we're talking about basic right and wrong. And if we're jumping on the side of wrong, that's a problem too. And especially, I could take abortion as one issue that's obvious, okay? But there are many other issues also. In many cases, matter of, one side happens to be lying and the other side isn't. Not always, but sometimes. Whatever the issue.
Whether it's, I don't think it's the most important thing.
Yeah, but I would agree with that. It's never as important as the work of the church, but I do think that we have an obligation to speak up about things as well. But we can. Let me say this. I use a good example. Westboro Baptist did more to hurt the cause of Christ than just about anybody could have, because of the way they protested. Okay,
For,
I have no
for
problem.
non-believers, right? Because I look at those people, I'm like, man, you guys are crazy.
Well, Westboro Baptist was the one that was protesting the
Yeah, I remember 2012.
protesting soldiers' funerals.
And the funerals.
Right.
There wasn't anybody that was gay or anything.
It was because there was gays in the
Funeral.
military.
It was just
Right.
total.
Yeah, and Westboro Baptist is a great example of ultra fundamentalist type teaching. So in other words, I think we have to be careful in how we say things, okay? By the same token, I think we also have to be a shining light saying this is right and this is
My
wrong.
point wasn't that we should
Yeah.
get out of politics.
Oh, I know, I know it was. I'm just saying there's both
I was
sides of that.
saying the people who wanted to punch you in the face on a business meeting.
Oh, yeah.
Is because they consider that the most important
Yes.
Yeah.
thing
Yeah.
to worry about.
And they weren't even believers.
But churches that aren't governed by congregational government, they can have big problems too.
Right. Let me say this.
People
the
just
last,
quietly leave.
Right. One of the churches actually, two churches that Linda and I had to leave in the past were because they were elder ruled, not elder led.
Mhm.
Okay. And in the end, not only that, but in the one case, they whittled the elders down to where instead of 9 or 10 people, they had 2 people that were left that controlled everything. But the point being is that as elder ruled churches, all of a sudden they took churches in directions that we said, we just can't be a part of this. So I think you can have, I think form of church government is an important topic, okay? But whether your form of church government is all democratic or whether your form of church government is elder ruled, the other extreme, or pastor ruled, which is even more extreme, you got problems in any of them because people are involved. If you go to ultra fundamentalist churches, a lot of times, even though it may not be written into their church constitution and bylaws, typically they are what I would call pastor ruled churches,
Right.
where if the pastor said it, you better be doing it.
That's a more typical pattern for these really fundamental.
It is. And not only that, I remember one woman that came up to me after a service where I preached at in Lanham and was literally in tears because I said, look, if you check out what I'm saying, if I'm saying something wrong, question me on it, tell me I'm wrong and come up and let's talk about it. Okay, if you can show me it's wrong in the Bible, I'm all for it and I'll retract it. I was talking in general. That put her in tears. The reason? Because as a young child, she basically had her mother and the pastor telling her, I don't know, she was possessed or something, whatever, because she went to the pastor and questioned something the pastor said. You don't question in that church.
It's terrible.
I know it is. My point is, anything I say you can question. I'm fine with that. Because not only that, anything I say, there have been some cases, where little things usually, but some cases where it's like, oh yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that is a better way to explain it. You never know.
I think was it last week you were talking about revelation versus
Yes,
understanding.
yes, exactly.
So if the pastor or whoever thinks God told me this,
Yeah,
so you better listen to me,
right,
that's not good.
right. I do
Now,
believe,
if it's God's helping you to understand something that was already revealed,
yes.
I think that's okay.
Yeah. I would say if you've already studied it, yes. I would say it's just not going to pop knowledge into your head,
Or
but
even revealed in the
Maybe
sense of well, Paul said this
Yeah,
2,000 years ago.
right. I understand what you're
And
saying.
I'm
That's
just
fine.
helping you understand what he said.
Yeah, yeah. But I would say
It's new to
yeah.
me.
It's new
Yeah,
to
exactly. I understand.
It's not new revelation.
Yeah, exactly. And it's something where I would agree. Where I would say this. I think it's fine for somebody to say, you know, that they believe God is leading them to something. Okay.
Sure, that happens.
But God told me, and it's funny. I even got careful about not saying that. For example, I use this phrase with some friends who understood me. I don't use it in general. God told me to go to seminary. I firmly believe that. Would I say that among people who didn't understand what I meant? No, because they think, divine revelation? No. Two things. Other human interaction that happened in 1 week that was almost unbelievable. And then also, in addition to that, for a couple of weeks before that, the Holy Spirit working on me saying, all right, it's time, get back, finish your Bible college, get into seminary. Now, is that when I say God told me? Yes, in a way, but I never heard an audible voice. I never heard, you know what I'm saying. Other people, on the other hand, when they say God told me, means, okay, God just said this because I was speaking in tongues, and therefore, I'm running to them.
He's telling you to do something
Right.
personally.
That's different
It's
too.
not really revelation.
Right. He's
Command.
these people, right, and I agree with that. These people in general were saying, God has told me this is what this church needs to do.
Right.
Yeah. So I would say again, you got to be. I know other pastors who have said, and I agree with them. They always their hair rises up in the back of their neck when they hear the word God told me, because they know where that's going usually. Yeah. I mean, if you're a pastor and somebody says God told me, and they're walking up and they're talking to you, you generally don't want to hear the last half of that sentence, whatever it is. And again, normally it's, you know, some of the things people will tell you that God told them. You just shake your head. I had a person asked me if they should divorce their wife so they could dedicate more time to serving God. You know, nothing wrong with their marriage, but they'd have more time on their hands if they didn't have a wife and kids. And I said, I don't think God told you that. That was an extreme example. I will say this also. I had a friend who was a pastor, and he told me about a funeral he did. And at that funeral, you had the relatives all speaking, coming up, and one of the relatives comes up and says, now everybody knows I was Mama's favorite child. Mama, grandmother, I forget, was Mama's favorite child. Well, from the audience you heard, you weren't her favorite, I was. Okay? He told me by the time it finished, they were literally, a dozen people rolling in the aisles, fist fighting, slugging each other because somebody dared say they were the favorite child.
This was
Now,
at a funeral?
At a funeral, yes, in a church. Now, he was presiding. Now, I will say this, officiating. I don't know if that was a Christian family or not, but another example of how things can just get totally out of hand, and the backbiting. Now, we're using extreme examples here.
That wasn't a church you went to.
No, it wasn't. But let me say this. I don't know what church it occurred in, but the guy, it was a church where I went to his church for a while, yeah. The pastor that told me
You got
about
so
it.
many stories of, horrible churches.
Yeah.
How many churches have you been to?
Oh, in my life? A
What'd you
bunch
like?
of them. Well, I started off at a Lutheran. And when I was 14, when I got saved, I was 13, but within a year or so, I realized, Lutheran church isn't where I need to be. And by about 16 or so, we changed to a Baptist church. I was there for probably 7 years or so.
Your parents also? Or?
My parents went there also there.
Oh, okay.
And I was going to say, then went to Forsyth Memorial for a number of years, went to Glendale Baptist, I don't remember, I've been going to church for well over 60 years, so you end up, and honestly, in a lot of cases, it's a good church, and then suddenly you've got elder rules that take it the wrong way. I had one church where it's like, I won't say they were sinful, but I felt this wasn't the place for me. They wanted to take the entire church and do away with teaching and turn it into a secret church. I don't think that's the right way to go for a church. I'm not going to say they were sinning, but you see what I'm saying.
What do you do with the secrets?
Yeah,
Secret church.
Secret church is basically just trying to get people saved and get them in the door and everything without teaching. Well, I shouldn't say that. They don't all do that. But in this case, it wasn't. They had a good history of being a teaching church.
Yeah.
And they were drawing people in. But they wanted to change that completely.
There was a move about, I don't remember when it was.
Back in the 80s
but
in particular, yeah.
About being seeker sensitive. So
Right.
seeker is somebody who is looking for God in some way or another, and then trying to fashion your church all about that.
Pulling in all the
And
secrets.
that's where you've got a grain of truth
Yep.
But where it was taken to, literally, they would stop the basically, you'd have things. I know churches that literally say, we're not going to talk about the resurrection or crucifixion because that's offensive to these seekers.
Wow.
No, you have to tell the whole story.
Because
Not only
eventually
that-
that's gonna.
Yeah.
You're gonna get people with no knowledge of anything.
You get people that think they're saved who aren't because they don't know anything what they're saved in.
Yeah.
Not only that, also, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not against having a coffee bar in your lobby if you can, okay? I don't think it's wrong or sinful. But when the entire purpose of having a coffee bar there is to make people believe that, we're not really a church, we're this or that. I'll give you an example. At Willow Creek. My uncle took a tour of Willow Creek years ago, okay? And he
It's
asked
the
about...
one out near Chicago.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the one where, that was one of the first initial seeker churches, okay? And a big mega church. I mean, probably a 10,000. I don't know for sure, but it was a big one.
Least, yeah.
Anyway, he went to Willow Creek, and partway through the tour, he said, I'm just curious. I haven't seen a cross anywhere in this building, okay? And they said, well, you might find somebody that has one in a drawer or something like that, but even that would be unusual because we've been told no crosses out in the open. Why? Seekers are there and the cross is offensive. Well, yeah, it's offensive, but that's the whole point of it.
I've never heard it's offensive.
Yeah,
I've never heard that something like that's
Well,
offensive.
Oh, it is. Well, think of it.
There's verses in the New Testament that say
Yeah.
it's an offense to the
It
Greek.
is. It is.
Outside of the demon possessed.
No. Think about this. The cross, what it represents. Okay, it represents a new lifestyle. It means you can't do everything you wanted to do. It means you have to have changes.
Well, don't do it, you people. Go.
But you see what I'm saying? No, that is offensive to some people.
Okay.
It also, in addition to that, I was going to say, think about it. You're talking about
Because we're limiting other people that they don't even know.
yeah. But not only that, but think about this. We're also saying that the salvation of mankind comes through the beating, torture, and bloody death that you can't even imagine how hard it was of a person. And you see what I'm saying? That's offensive.
Yeah,
That's one. That in that case, the Greeks didn't understand it. Basically, that's why it was offensive to them.
That's one of those things.
So-
like you can twist something. It's like I think it was a Simpsons where it was like how to cook 4 humans, like 4.
Yeah.
And then they kept, and it was like they just added one word and it completely changed.
Well, yeah. Not
the definition.
What that was based on was I actually saw it yesterday. That's why it's funny.
You saw that
No,
yesterday?
there's an episode of Twilight Zone called "To Serve Man."
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
To serve man, what happens is this. I forget where they came from. This alien comes.
Some other planet.
Yeah, for another planet. Yeah, but
And
the
then
alien comes
big
in.
Blind saucer.
Right. They land. They come to the UN, and he leaves this book, and all they can do is translate the title of it. And they don't know what it's to serve man. So after a while, everybody's just going to the other planet and everything else. And the last scene is the guy being shoved onto the flying saucer with the person to finish translating the rest of the book. No, get off the saucer! To serve man, it's a cookbook.
Yeah, it's a cookbook,
exactly.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's what it's probably
been
based on.
funded a lot
Yeah.
of times. I know.
And that's still the Twilight. There's one channel that had nothing but Twilight Zone. Amazon Prime has Twilight Zones on over and over. But the point being is that I think that's what it's based on. But here's my point. Back with the cross again. The cross is symbolic of things that people don't want to hear.
Right.
So Willow Creek decided, and I normally don't name churches, but in this case I think it's okay to name them. Willow Creek decided that no, we're not going to have crosses in here.
They've
because that's
already
offensive.
established their name pretty broadly.
Yeah, and not only that, think about that, what they're also saying is they didn't want people to see a cross when they come in because after all, they might be offended by that and what the representation of it and what it means. And therefore, well, let's just get them out of this religious idea. Let's just try to get them in, and be friendly with them. So I'm all for being friendly with people. So there's a grain of truth to it, okay?
What was the one phrase, I think it was Bonhoeffer used, religionless Christianity.
Yeah, I like that.
That's what
Right.
some people want.
Right, exactly.
It's a surface idea, so it sounds good if you don't think about it,
He gets you.
and then if you do think about it, it's a nightmare.
He gets you.
Yeah.
No repentance. No change of lifestyle. Again, is there a grain of truth? Absolutely. God will take anyone and save them if they come to Him and turn and save. It takes belief. And then that belief will cause their life to change.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, the lie there is like,
But that's not what they're
he can
teaching.
understand who you are,
Yeah.
but that isn't the problem. I mean,
Right.
it's like you need to, you should understand who God is.
Yeah. And that whole movement is trying to say whatever you do is fine.
Yeah. Oh, and that's exactly what they're trying to say.
Instead of, no, God is the standard and we should change our lives according to His standard.
Yeah.
Now, we're not always going to succeed, but that's the idea behind it. So that's how we're talking here. And let me say this also. I don't want to, I've used examples here of grotesque examples. Oh, by the way, back to the church question. Over the years.
I was just trying to do the math.
Yeah, no, I was going to say
How long have
probably,
you been here? When are you going to go to the next one?
probably 10 at least. And let me say this. In some cases, it hasn't been because of bad things. In some cases, it's been because the church needed me somewhere else. Let me say this: how long am I going to be here? I have no idea. I'm a member of this church. I'm all in and everything else.
wasn't
But
really trying to-
no. The reason I say that, because I actually had somebody talk to me in the last couple of weeks about, do you want to be an interim pastor over at another place? I don't think so, because I looked at the traffic patterns and I'm like, I don't think so. But the point is that, and that's not something I'm jumping and trying to find either. But the point is that, I have no idea if God takes us away for some reason. Now I'll say this: if you guys turned into a bunch of heretics, yeah, we'd leave. But I don't see that happening.
It depends on how many times I play the piano.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, you got to remember also is that there's also some things where it's like we may not like something, but is it heretical? Is it something where you're leading people away from Christ? Is it something where that's a different story? And that's where, like I said, I think we had to draw the line again with the one situation that we did leave one of the elder-led churches. We weren't the only one that left. The pastor left, and we left a week after he left. Him and I talked about it for a long time beforehand, and basically I caught some of the people just flat out lying to me, and I have it in writing that they lied to me. And again, this was an elder-ruled church, even though they didn't want to call it that. And the pastor left. Why did he leave? He couldn't deal with the elders he had in his church, period. That was the reason. He would have loved to have stayed there. He would have loved going on, another 5 or 10 years maybe. But
So that would be an example of.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was
Really?
yeah, that would be an example of this.
Okay.
And in that case, I didn't want to leave. Let me say this: I had a Sunday school class. I don't know how big it was. I had the main sanctuary as the adult Sunday school classes, and I do know this: it was at least some mornings it was at least 60 people in that Sunday school class. I mean, let me say this: it was big enough that they had to hook me up with a microphone. That I had to teach that way. With one of the head mics and stuff like that. So, did I want to leave? No, I had been teaching that class probably about. What's funny? When I started teaching the class, I'd been teaching for about probably 6 or 8 months, maybe a year tops. When I started teaching that class, the first Sunday I had 20 people show up, but it kept growing. That's why after 2 weeks they had to switch me to the sanctuary. They had a bunch of other classes also. But the point being is that I would have loved to stay there, but couldn't do it because of what was being taught and what was being handed down as well. So there's some cases where you have to leave for that. There's other cases where honestly it's like, something, this is a better fit theologically. In other cases, when I left the Lutheran church, that was like, no, Baptist church is a better fit theologically for me. In other cases, it's because God's leading you to some place that needs you. Linda and I a couple of times stopped at churches and said, something, this isn't the church we picked, but this church desperately wants, and we didn't hold official positions. But we were there for a while because it was obvious they needed us there and they wanted us there. So it's like, okay. So I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if I was here another 10 years. I also wouldn't be surprised if it was, next week if I end up someplace, whatever God wants.
I think expecting, no arguments whatsoever is unrealistic.
Right, it is.
But yeah, biting and devouring
Right.
is a lot more intense than just
Yeah, much more visceral, especially when you realize it's the snakes.
normal arguments.
It's the snakes that are doing the biting, and again with how they're born, it's like that type of thing.
I don't know if it ties into this at all, but
Yeah.
there is an interesting, I can't remember what it's called. There's an emblem of a snake that's literally eating its own tail.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Something like
I forget
that.
what it's about.
Don't
Yeah.
tread on me. That
I don't think
It isn't
Flag.
it isn't the
I don't know if
spiral
it's a Gaston
one.
flag, is it?
It's literally a circle.
Yeah, it's literally
It
one.
has
I know what he's
spikes.
talking about. I don't remember what
So
it
he's
is.
literally devouring himself.
Yeah, exactly. But that's kind of what Christ's talking about. Now, let me say this. I do think it's a good idea to have, as little arguments as far as people being argumentative. I do think this. Theologically, I don't want to use the term arguments, but I think, we should have debates. We should have deep discussions. We should have things where you walk away and say, I have a different position than you do. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I don't mean
I know what you mean.
that. I mean like personality clashes.
Yeah, that's the type of, exactly.
Those are going to happen no matter what.
Sure, but even there, we should try to minimize them.
Right, and we can, even though this biting is snake bite,
Yeah.
we have this, you can have biting comments.
Yeah, you
Maybe
can.
that's not what it's meant there, but I still
I'm good at them. No.
You should avoid those.
Yeah.
You can have these differing opinions.
Yeah,
But it's really easy to just slip one of those in.
right.
So,
Walk away. Got it. And it's funny. You have to say that also. Same thing applies to a marriage. Are you going to get that zinger in that you really took care of it, or are you going to go, this really isn't the way to handle this?
right, yeah.
So again, this is something where I think that, and by the way, the other thing, even if I were to take a position like that or something like that I was talking about, I would still, I assume, come here and teach tonight. So that wouldn't even change things there. But anyway, what I was going to say is, no, I think this is something, again, where we got to look at it and go, what is he talking about? What is he really getting at here? And I know we've taken a lot of time talking about this, but the reason is there's a lot of application in the real world today for churches. There really is. I'm actually going to say here, with the time the way it is, I don't think it's a good idea to go to 16. Yeah.
Who's your neighbor, emphasizing other Christians in the church.
Yes.
If people see that we love each other,
Right.
it means they want to join the church.
Yes.
Because of that.
I've actually been in churches where people have said, I'm joining this church because you're so loving.
Yeah.
And they didn't want anything either. When I was at Glendale Baptist, there was, except for the pastor, it was a very loving atmosphere. That was a problem, I know. That's a whole different thing.
But there should be a contrast with the world around it.
Yeah, it is. And there was. No, when people came in there, one thing they were saying is, man, I walk in this church and 7 old ladies are hugging me before I can get down the hall and stuff. And it's not because they really mean it. They're, you know what I'm saying? They're really, and they're smiling and they're happy and they're hugging and they're shaking hands and and when they say we're glad that you're here today, they mean it. They're not just trying to get me. Yeah, that was one of the friendliest churches I've ever been to. It really was. And yeah.
So I see the contrast here. First he says, love your neighbor as yourself. We're talking about the
Right.
brotherhood, and then on the opposite side, don't bite and devour each other.
Right.
And a loving church is not just the absence of biting.
Right. Absolutely.
Right? There's a big difference. Like, this was a great church. They don't bite each other.
Right. They don't talk either.
Yeah.
Right.
But there's the love.
Right.
Well, I think it's one is saying if P then Q. One is saying if not Q then not P.
Right.
Yeah.
And not only
Yeah.
not only Yeah, I know. I didn't correct her. Yeah, P equals Q does mean Q equals P, but it's the not that. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. But what I was going to say is when you're looking at that, I agree with you completely. And if you want a church that never has an argument, no talking. Period. and no glances either.
No people.
No people. Right. No people.
No
exactly.
people.
Well, seriously, you say no people. That's very similar to people say, I want a secure network, completely secure.
Go
I said,
in
well,
that case.
networks, there's two extremes, ultra secure and ultra usable. And it's a sliding scale. You can't have both. You want total security, I can do that. The first thing we do is we find a closet, cinder block walls or something like that. We put the server in the closet with all that stuff in it. We reformat the disk so there's nothing on them. We then pull the power plug so that it can't power up the server. We then lock the door and bolt it and put it there, and we have complete security on that network. That's true. But it's not usable at all. The other extreme that I've seen is, we just want everybody to be able to use these things. And I've seen networks like that. And what's their password? Well, except for the people that are 1, 2, 3, 4, that type of thing. So my point being is, you've got both extremes. Neither one works in the real world. But I think we got the same thing here is, with the churches we're talking about, with the various extremes. I think, again, it's something where fortunately in this church, I have not seen anything approaching the biting and devouring, okay? I would say this, there's always little areas we can work on. So, that's still good. This is more of an advice thing to us as opposed to Paul saying, that we're in that category of biting and devouring.
I'm sure there have been contentious business meetings over the years.
I'm sure there has
I
been.
don't think anyone's ever punched someone in the face.
No.
Never had that.
No threats of punching.
No threats.
Are you just talking about in this church or just
Yes.
Yeah.
in the corporate world in general?
Well, actually, I've been told about some of the history of it, and in the long history, from what I understand, there were some very contentious business meetings.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Real big one in 1984.
that's what I mean. I don't know the details. I wasn't here, but
No punches thrown.
yeah, no, I understand no punches. But let me say this: I was in a church. I told you about the church where the guy was a total fraud. What happened? So what they do? They finally got rid of him. They got rid of the other people stormed off and everything. They were left in another church. They decided to call a pastor. And the last thing my dad said to him was, "So how were his references?" We didn't check any references. Have you lost your mind? And then when we checked the references, it was like, uh-oh. And things turn really ugly again, but it's sometimes people don't learn. And that's another one where the business meetings, every business meeting was bad there. It's only a question of how bad. But if you guys went through that in 84, no, I understand what you went through. It's not fun. It never is fun. Again, I'm glad that I'm glad that we're not in that category. We can always strive to be more in the first category. And the reason I'm not going to go into 16 tonight, let me say this. We've talked about not doing this or doing that. We haven't really talked about how the ability is given to us to do that or where that comes from. And 16 changes the focus dramatically as far as what's going on. Because I'll say this, while we should be trying, okay, I do believe that if it's human effort and that's all we're putting into it, we're never going to really succeed. And 16 changes the whole focus as far as that goes. And that's what we're going to get into next week. All right, I'll go ahead and close this in prayer, and we'll go from there. Father, I thank you for giving us your word. I thank you for giving us your Son. I thank you for all you've done for us. I do ask that we understand what we can of your word as well as interpret it and apply it. I thank you for all this and ask this in Christ's name. Amen. And by the way, my biblical assistant who helps me when I get in trouble with Greek will be here next week. Her trip got extended for another week up in Canada. So
34% longer.
yes, exactly right. No, yeah, 34, not quite. Yeah, actually, if you look at it that way, yes, it would be. So yeah, she ended up like an extra 4 days. So.